I stood in the doorway of my son's sprawling suburban home, the November chill biting through my thin cardigan, watching through the bay window as my family gathered around a table laden with food I wasn't welcome to touch. Golden turkey, mountains of mashed potatoes, cranberry sauce glistening like rubies under the chandelier light. My stomach growled, a humiliating reminder that I'd skipped breakfast, expecting the traditional Thanksgiving feast my family had shared for 43 years. But this year everything had changed. This year my son Marcus had looked me in the eye 2 hours ago and said the words that would shatter everything I thought I knew about my family, about sacrifice, about the invisible labor of motherhood that spans decades. You didn't contribute, Mom. You can't expect to just show up and eat when everyone else brought something or helped prepare the meal. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning had started innocently enough. I'd woken at 5:30 in my small apartment, the one-bedroom place I'd moved to after Harold passed away 18 months ago. The apartment that Marcus had helped me find, assuring me it was perfect for my needs, affordable on my widow's pension, close to the senior center where I volunteered 3 days a week. I'd laid out my nicest dress, the navy blue one with the pearl buttons that Harold had always loved, and spent extra time on my makeup, wanting to look my best for what I assumed would be a day of warmth and family connection. Marcus had texted me the night before with the address, even though I'd been to his house a dozen times since he and his wife Stephanie bought it 3 years ago. Dinner at 2 sharp, the message read. Don't be late. Stephanie's been cooking since yesterday. I'd felt a flutter of excitement. My daughter-in-law was an excellent cook, though she'd never quite warmed to me the way I'd hoped when Marcus first brought her home 7 years ago. She was ambitious, driven, a corporate lawyer who worked 60-hour weeks and seemed to view any moment not spent advancing her career as time wasted. I'd arrived at 1:30, wanting to help with last-minute preparations the way I always had when Harold was alive and we hosted Thanksgiving at our house. Those had been different times. Our modest 3-bedroom home had been filled with laughter, the scent of my mother's secret stuffing recipe, Harold's terrible jokes that everyone groaned at but secretly loved, Marcus, my daughter Lauren, their spouses, and eventually the grandchildren, all crammed around our dining table that we'd pull out to its full extension, adding folding chairs at the ends. But Harold's death had changed everything. The cancer had been swift and merciless, taking him from diagnosis to grave in 7 months. I'd sold our house afterward, unable to bear the memories in every corner. The ghost of my husband in his favorite reading chair, at the kitchen table where he'd done crossword puzzles every morning for 35 years. Marcus had been supportive during that time, helping me sort through decades of accumulated possessions, driving me to estate sales to sell furniture that wouldn't fit in my new apartment, assuring me that downsizing was the right choice. When I'd knocked on Marcus's door that Thanksgiving afternoon, my arms empty because I'd assumed I'd be helping cook rather than bringing a finished dish, Stephanie had answered with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was immaculate as always, her blonde hair styled in perfect waves, wearing a designer dress that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Behind her, I could see the house in full holiday glory. A massive floral centerpiece on the entry table, fall decorations artfully arranged, everything looking like it had been pulled from a magazine spread. Patricia, she'd said, my name sounding somehow formal in her mouth despite 7 years of family connection. You're early. It wasn't a greeting so much as an observation, possibly an accusation. I glanced at my watch, confused. 1:30, just as I'd planned, giving me time to help before the 2 o'clock meal. I thought I could help with preparations, I'd offered, trying to step inside, but Stephanie remained in the doorway, her body language subtly blocking my entrance. Oh, that won't be necessary. Everything's under control. Marcus is in the kitchen with his sister, and my parents brought most of the sides. We're actually just doing final plating now. Her parents. I hadn't known Stephanie's parents would be there. In 7 years of marriage to my son, I'd met them perhaps 3 times. They lived in California, wealthy tech executives who seemed to view their daughter's marriage to a high school principal as somewhat beneath her potential. The few times we'd been in the same room, they'd been polite but distant, the kind of people who could make you feel invisible while looking directly at you. Well, I can still help, I'd persisted, my smile feeling more strained. Even if it's just setting the table or pouring drinks. Stephanie had hesitated, then stepped aside with obvious reluctance. I suppose you can come in. But really, Patricia, we have everything handled. The house had been full of people I barely knew. Stephanie's parents, Richard and Claire, sat in the living room with drinks, discussing stock portfolios with Marcus's business partner and his wife. My daughter Lauren was there with her husband Kevin and their 2 children, my grandchildren, but she was deep in conversation with someone I didn't recognize, laughing at something on her phone. Lauren had always been closer to her father than to me, a daddy's girl from birth, and after Harold's death she'd seemed to retreat further, as if losing him meant losing interest in maintaining our relationship as well. I'd made my way to the kitchen, where Marcus was indeed working alongside what appeared to be a catering team. Not family members cooking together, but hired professionals in matching black attire, efficiently plating appetizers and arranging serving dishes. My son looked up when I entered, and something flickered across his face. Surprise maybe, or was it annoyance? "Mom," he'd said, wiping his hands on a towel. "You're here." Again, that flat observation rather than a warm greeting. I'd felt the first stirrings of unease but pushed them down. This was my son, my firstborn, the baby I'd rocked through countless nights, the toddler I'd taught to read, the teenager I'd supported through every crisis and triumph. We were close. We'd always been close. "I'm here to help," I'd announced brightly, reaching for an apron hanging on a hook by the pantry. Marcus had exchanged a glance with one of the catering staff, a young woman who was arranging bacon-wrapped dates on a silver platter. "Actually, Mom, we're pretty much done here. Why don't you go join everyone in the living room? Dinner will be ready soon." I'd felt dismissed but tried not to show it. "Are you sure? I could at least help carry things out or maybe arrange the bread basket. You know I make those herb butter rosettes that everyone loves." Another glance between Marcus and the catering woman. "We have butter, Mom. Store-bought." "It's fine. Store-bought butter. A Thanksgiving." I'd made homemade herb butter for our family gatherings since before Marcus could walk. A recipe from my own mother, passed down through 3 generations. But I'd swallowed my hurt and retreated to the living room, where I'd perched awkwardly on the edge of a leather sofa that probably cost more than my car, trying to make conversation with people who seemed to have no interest in talking to me. Stephanie's father, Richard, had asked what I did, and when I'd explained that I was retired from my nursing career and now volunteered at the senior center, his eyes had glazed over with disinterest before he turned back to his wife to continue their conversation about their recent trip to Dubai. Lauren had given me a quick hug, distracted, before her children had pulled her away to show her something on the massive television in the game room. I'd sat there for 20 minutes, feeling increasingly invisible, wondering why this day felt so different from every other Thanksgiving I'd experienced. When Marcus had finally announced that dinner was ready, everyone had migrated to the dining room, where the table was set with fine china and crystal glasses, place cards designating where each person should sit. I'd searched for my name, walking around the table twice before accepting the reality. There were 12 place settings. 13 people in the house counting me. My card wasn't there. "Marcus," I'd called to my son, who was helping the catering staff bring out serving dishes. "I think you might have forgotten my place card." He'd looked at the table, then at me, and something in his expression had made my blood run cold. It wasn't forgetfulness. It was intentional. "Mom, can we talk in the kitchen for a minute?" My legs had felt weak as I'd followed him, aware of curious glances from the other guests. In the kitchen, with the catering staff politely stepping away to give us privacy, Marcus had crossed his arms, the stance he'd taken since he was a teenager whenever he was about to deliver news he knew I wouldn't like. "What's going on?" I'd asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Where am I supposed to sit?" "Mom, here's the thing." He'd taken a deep breath, not quite meeting my eyes. "Stephanie and I discussed this, and we thought it would be best if you understood the new dynamic we're trying to establish in our household." New dynamic? The words had sent ice through my veins. "What new dynamic, Marcus? I'm your mother. This is Thanksgiving." "Exactly," he'd said, as if that explained everything. "This is Thanksgiving, a day about being grateful for what we have, about sharing a meal with people who contribute to our lives. And Mom, the reality is, you haven't really contributed anything today. Everyone else brought dishes or helped prepare the meal. Stephanie's parents paid for the catering. Lauren brought 3 pies and a vegetable casserole. Even Kevin helped Marcus smoke the turkey yesterday. But you just showed up expecting to be fed without bringing anything or helping in any meaningful way. I'd stared at my son, this man I'd raised, trying to comprehend what he was saying. I offered to help. Stephanie told me everything was under control. And I didn't bring a dish because I thought like always I'd help cook here. That's what we've always done, Marcus. That's what family does. That's what we used to do, he'd corrected. When Dad was alive, when you had a house to host in. But things are different now. Stephanie works incredibly hard. And she spent 2 full days preparing for this meal. Her parents contributed financially. Everyone pulled their weight except you. The words had hit me like physical blows. Pulled their weight. As if the 43 years I'd spent raising him, the countless meals I'd cooked.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
The nights I'd stayed up when he was sick, the college tuition Harold and I had scrimped and saved to provide, as if none of that counted as contribution. So what are you saying? I'd asked, though part of me already knew, already felt the sharp edge of rejection cutting through the mother-son bond I'd thought was unbreakable. I'm saying, Marcus had replied, his voice taking on a lecturing tone I recognized from his work as a principal, the voice he probably used with misbehaving students, that you can't just expect to show up and take advantage of other people's hard work. If you want to be part of this family meal, you need to contribute. Since you didn't bring anything or help prepare, it doesn't seem fair to the others who did make an effort. I'd felt tears pricking at my eyes but refused to let them fall. Not here. Not in front of the son who was essentially uninviting me from Thanksgiving dinner. Are you telling me I can't eat? The question had come out smaller than I'd intended. The voice of a wounded child rather than a 64-year-old woman. I'm telling you that actions have consequences, and that maybe this will be a learning experience for next time. Next year, you'll know to bring something or offer to help pay for catering. He'd reached out as if to touch my shoulder, then thought better of it. Don't take it personally, Mom. It's just about fairness. Don't take it personally. How was I supposed to not take personally being excluded from a family meal by my own son? I'd looked past him to where I could see the dining room, everyone taking their seats, Lauren not even glancing toward the kitchen to see where I was, too absorbed in arranging her children's napkins and cutting their turkey into small pieces. Stephanie's parents settling into the seats at either end of the table, the places of honor, where Harold and I used to sit when we hosted. I see, I'd managed to say, though I didn't see at all, didn't understand how the world had shifted so completely that a mother could be denied a seat at her own son's table. Then I suppose I should go. Marcus had nodded, relief flickering across his face. That's probably for the best. Like I said, don't take it personally. We'll have you over another time, maybe for a casual dinner when there's less pressure. I'd walked back through the living room in a daze, retrieving my purse and coat from the entry closet. Through the dining room doorway I could see everyone laughing, passing dishes, Marcus taking his seat at the table with an empty chair beside him where Stephanie sat. That empty chair could have been mine. Should have been mine. But instead I was being dismissed like an unwelcome stranger. No one called out goodbye. No one asked where I was going. Lauren briefly glanced up as I passed, registered my coat and purse, and looked away without a word. My grandchildren didn't even notice my departure, too excited about the meal. Before them. And Marcus, my son, the child I'd given life to, whom I'd sacrificed so much for, didn't walk me to the door or offer any word of comfort or explanation beyond his cold assessment of my lack of contribution. I'd driven home in shock, my hands shaking on the steering wheel, replaying the conversation over and over, trying to understand where I'd gone wrong, what I'd missed. When I'd arrived at my apartment, the silence had been deafening. I'd stood in my small kitchen, looking at the frozen dinner I'd have to heat up because I had no Thanksgiving meal, no family gathering, no place at any table. That's when the anger had started to seep in, hot and righteous beneath the hurt. Contribution. Marcus wanted to talk about contribution. As if I hadn't contributed everything I had to giving him and Lauren the best possible life. As if I hadn't worked double shifts as a nurse to help pay for his education. Hadn't postponed my own dreams so he could achieve his. As if I hadn't been there for every single milestone, every challenge, every moment he needed support. I'd sat at my small dining table, that frozen dinner untouched in front of me, and made a decision. If Marcus wanted to discuss contribution, if he wanted to reduce our relationship to a transactional exchange where only recent effort counted, then fine. I could play that game. But he was about to learn a very important lesson about exactly how much his mother had contributed over the years, and what happened when that contribution was suddenly withdrawn. The next morning, the day after Thanksgiving, I woke with a clarity of purpose I hadn't felt since Harold's death. For 18 months I'd been drifting, trying to figure out who I was without my husband of 37 years, without the house we'd built a life in, without the familiar rhythms of the existence I'd known. But Marcus's rejection had ignited something in me, a determination to reclaim my value, to force my children to see exactly what they'd taken for granted for so long. I started with research. I sat at my laptop, a skill I'd had to learn late in life but had become proficient in, and began calculating nursing care rates, childcare costs, cooking and housekeeping services, tutoring fees, emergency support. I made a spreadsheet, something else I'd taught myself in recent years, and started listing every single thing I'd done for Marcus over the past 43 years. Every meal cooked, every load of laundry washed, every school project helped with, every childhood illness tended to, every financial gift given, every favor provided. The numbers were staggering. When I factored in current market rates for the services I provided, adjusted for inflation where appropriate, the total came to well over $800,000. $800,000 of contribution that Marcus had dismissed as irrelevant because I hadn't brought a casserole to his catered Thanksgiving dinner. But I wasn't done. I also began documenting the financial support Harold and I had provided over the years. The down payment assistance for Marcus's first house, $20,000 we'd pulled from our retirement savings. The car we'd bought him when he graduated college. The professional wardrobe we'd purchased when he got his first teaching job. The countless smaller gifts, the emergency loans that were never repaid, the vacations we'd funded so he and Stephanie could travel without financial stress. When I added it all together, Harold and I had provided Marcus with over $150,000 in direct financial support over the years, not counting the intangible value of our time, love, and emotional labor. $150,000 that apparently didn't count as contribution in his new transactional worldview. I printed out my spreadsheet, all 23 pages of itemized contributions with supporting documentation where I had it. Receipts I'd saved, bank statements from when Harold was alive that showed transfers to Marcus's account, credit card bills showing purchases made for him. I'd always been organized, a habit from my nursing days where attention to detail could mean the difference between life and death. Now that organizational skill was going to serve a different purpose. My next step was legal consultation. I made an appointment with an attorney, a woman named Janet Pierce who specialized in family law. When I explained my situation, sitting in her clean, professional office the following Monday, she'd listened with an expression that shifted from sympathy to strategic interest. "What exactly are you hoping to accomplish, Patricia?" she'd asked when I finished my story. "I want my son to understand the value of what he's dismissed," I'd replied. "I want him to see in concrete terms exactly what my contribution has been worth. And I want recompense for the way he treated me." Janet had leaned back in her chair, tapping a pen against her legal pad. "You understand that you can't actually sue your son for repayment of gifts or parental support provided during his childhood. That's not how the law works." "I know that," I'd said. "But I can withdraw my ongoing support, can't I? I can stop providing the services he's come to expect, and I can make clear in writing exactly what he's losing." A slow smile had spread across Janet's face. "Oh, absolutely. You have every right to establish boundaries and to discontinue voluntary assistance. And documenting the value of what you've provided, purely for your own records and to inform future decisions about your estate, that's entirely within your rights as well." We'd spent an hour discussing strategy. Janet helped me refine my spreadsheet, making it more legally presentable. She drafted a letter, professional and carefully worded to avoid any hint of legal threat, but making crystal clear what I'd provided and what would no longer be available. And she gave me advice on other steps I could take, ways to demonstrate my value that would be impossible for Marcus to ignore. I left her office feeling powerful for the first time since Harold's death. For 18 months I'd felt diminished, a lesser version of myself defined by loss and absence. But now I had a mission, a purpose, a way to reclaim my dignity and force my children to confront their own ingratitude and cruelty. That evening I called my sister Diane, who lived 3 states away but had always been my closest confidant. I told her everything, from the Thanksgiving rejection to my plan for response. She'd listened in shocked silence, then exploded with supportive outrage. "He did what? Patricia, that's unconscionable. After everything you've done for that boy. After all the sacrifices you and Harold made." "I know," I'd said, feeling validated by her reaction. "And that's why I'm taking action. I'm not going to be treated like some irrelevant old woman who should be grateful for whatever crumbs her children throw her way." Diane had been quiet for a moment, then asked carefully, "Are you sure about this? Once you send that letter, once you set this in motion, there's no taking it back. Your relationship with Marcus might be permanently damaged." "It's already damaged," I'd replied. "He damaged it when he denied me a seat at his table. I'm just making the damage visible instead of swallowing it and pretending everything's fine." My sister had sighed but ultimately agreed to support me. "Then do what you need to do. And if you need a place to stay for a while, my guest room is always open. Maybe some distance from all of this would be good for you." The idea had taken root immediately. Distance. A fresh start. Not running away but making a point, showing Marcus that I had a life beyond being his mother, beyond waiting around to be included or excluded at his whim. I'd started researching options, looking at extended stay possibilities in Diane City, thinking about what it would mean to truly step back from my children's lives. But first I needed to send the letter. Janet delivered the final version to me on Wednesday, exactly 1 week after the Thanksgiving disaster. It was perfect, professionally worded, but emotionally devastating in its cool recitation of facts. It began with a simple statement of purpose, then launched into the detailed accounting of my contributions, financial and otherwise. It noted the recent rejection and explained that, given Marcus's clear position that family relationships should be transactional, and based on recent contribution rather than history or love, I would be adjusting my own approach accordingly. The letter went on to list all the ways I would no longer be available to contribute. No more babysitting for my grandchildren, a service I provided an average of twice a week for the past 8 years, saving Marcus and Stephanie an estimated $40,000 in childcare costs. No more running errands, picking up dry cleaning, grocery shopping, or handling other life maintenance tasks that I'd helped with regularly. No more birthday gifts, Christmas presents, or financial support of any kind. No more emergency assistance, whether financial, practical, or emotional. And then, the final paragraph, the one Janet and I had crafted most carefully. It informed Marcus that I would be revising my will and estate plans to reflect this new transactional understanding of our relationship. Since he'd made clear that contribution was the basis for inclusion and benefit, my estate would be distributed accordingly, with the bulk going to charitable organizations where my volunteer work was valued and appreciated, and to my sister who had consistently treated me with respect and love. I'd read that letter 20 times before finally sealing it in an envelope. My hands had trembled as I'd addressed it to Marcus and Stephanie at their home address. This wasn't just a letter. It was a declaration of independence, a refusal to accept the diminished role they'd assigned me, a demand to be seen and valued or else to be left alone entirely. I'd mailed it on Thursday morning, then immediately began packing for my trip to Diane's house. I didn't know how long I'd stay, but I knew I needed to be gone when Marcus received the letter, needed to not be available for the phone calls or visits that would surely come when he realized what he'd lost. The distance would give me strength, perspective, and the ability to stand firm in my decision. As I'd loaded my suitcase into my car that Friday morning, my phone had rung. Lauren, my daughter, who'd been at that Thanksgiving dinner and hadn't said a word as I was dismissed. I'd let it go to voicemail, not ready to talk to her yet, not sure if she was calling to apologize or to defend her brother. The voicemail she'd left was brief and told me everything I needed to know about where her loyalties lay. "Mom, Marcus told me about some letter you sent him. I haven't seen it, but he's pretty upset. I think you're overreacting to what happened on Thanksgiving. Marcus was just trying to establish boundaries and teach you about being more considerate. You embarrassed him in front of Stephanie's parents by making a scene." Maybe you should apologize and we can all move past this. Call me back. I deleted the voicemail without responding, anger burning fresh at her characterization of events. I'd made a scene? By quietly leaving when told I wasn't welcome at dinner? And the suggestion that I should apologize, that I was the one in the wrong, had confirmed that whatever action I took, I'd be taking it alone, without support from either of my children. The drive to Diane's had taken 7 hours of processing, raging, occasionally crying, and ultimately strengthening my resolve. My sister had welcomed me with open arms, a glass of wine, and a spare room that she'd quickly transformed into a sanctuary for me to heal and plan my next moves. And that was where I was now, 2 weeks after the Thanksgiving rejection, sitting in Diane's sun-filled guest room, waiting for the consequences of my letter to fully unfold. Marcus had called 37 times in the first 3 days after receiving it. I'd ignored every call. He'd sent text messages ranging from confused to angry to pleading. I'd read them all but responded to none. Lauren had called too, her messages becoming increasingly irritated that I wasn't answering, wasn't explaining myself, wasn't making it easy for them to smooth this over and return to the status quo where they could take me for granted. But I wasn't interested in making things easy anymore. I was interested in justice, in recognition, in forcing my children to confront exactly what they'd lost when they decided their mother's contribution didn't matter. And I had a plan for how to make that confrontation impossible to avoid. Because the letter was just the beginning. The real revenge, the real lesson was still to come. And when it did, Marcus would understand that denying me food on Thanksgiving wasn't just cruel. It was the biggest mistake of his life. A mistake that would cost him far more than a seat at a holiday table. A mistake that would reshape our family forever and force him to see his mother not as an obligatory burden, but as the foundation that his entire comfortable life had been built upon. A foundation that I was about to remove, stone by carefully calculated stone, until he understood exactly what it meant to truly have nothing to eat at the table of life because the person who'd always provided the meal had finally, permanently, walked away. The third week at Diane's house brought unexpected clarity. My sister had given me space to process while also gently pushing me to think beyond anger and revenge toward what I actually wanted my future to look like. We'd spent long evenings on her back porch, wrapped in blankets against the December cold, talking about everything from my marriage to Harold to my relationship with my children to who I wanted to be in this next chapter of my life. Diane was 3 years older than me and had never married, a choice she'd made deliberately after watching our mother sacrifice everything for our father, who'd left when we were teenagers anyway. She'd built a successful career as a financial advisor, traveled extensively, maintained a close circle of friends, and seemed genuinely content with her life in ways I was only beginning to understand might be possible for me too. One evening, she'd asked me a question that had stopped me mid-sentence. "Patricia, what do you actually want from Marcus?" Real answer, not the angry answer. If you could wave a magic wand and have any outcome from this situation, what would it be? I'd sat with that question for a long time, watching the stars emerge in Diane's suburban sky, so much clearer than they ever were in the city where I'd lived for 4 decades. "I want him to see me," I'd finally said. "Not as mom the convenient resource or mom the obligation, but as a whole person who has value beyond what I can do for him. I want him to understand that love isn't transactional. That family isn't about keeping score. And I want an apology, a real one, where he acknowledges how deeply he hurt me." Diane had nodded thoughtfully. "Those are reasonable wants. But Patricia, you need to prepare yourself for the possibility that Marcus might not be capable of giving you those things. Some people, even people we love, can't see past their own perspective. And if he can't or won't, you need to decide what that means for your relationship going forward." The question had haunted me. Could I actually walk away from my son permanently? Could I accept that the little boy I'd raised, the young man I'd been so proud of, had become someone who could treat his own mother with such casual cruelty? The thought was devastating, but so was the alternative of continuing to accept whatever scraps of affection and inclusion he chose to offer. My phone continued to ring daily. Marcus, Lauren, even Stephanie had called once, her message carefully neutral, suggesting we all sit down and talk like adults to resolve this misunderstanding. Misunderstanding, as if there were any ambiguity in being told I couldn't eat because I hadn't contributed enough. As if the problem were my comprehension rather than their behavior. But something shifted in the 4th week. I'd been helping Diane prepare dinner, a simple pasta dish with salad, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. On impulse, I'd answered, and an elderly woman's voice had greeted me. "Is this Patricia Greenwood? This is Harriet Chun from the Riverside Senior Center." Harriet was the director of the center where I'd volunteered for the past year, teaching basic computer skills to seniors and helping organize social activities. "Yes, this is Patricia. Is everything all right?" "Oh, everything's fine, dear. I'm actually calling because we've had several people asking about you. You've been gone for nearly a month now, and they miss you, especially your computer class students. They're quite lost without you." The words had hit me unexpectedly hard. In my focus on Marcus and the Thanksgiving incident, I'd completely forgotten about my volunteer commitments, about the people who'd come to rely on my weekly presence, who valued what I offered without needing to be forced to see it. "I'm so sorry, Harriet. I should have called. I've been dealing with some family matters out of state. I didn't mean to just disappear." Harriet's voice had been warm, understanding. "Family matters, I completely understand. But Patricia, I wanted you to know that your contribution here has been invaluable. The board actually met last week, and we'd like to offer you a part-time paid position as our technology coordinator. It's not much, maybe 15 hours a week, but we have a small budget now and everyone agrees you deserve to be compensated for the work you do." A paid position. Recognition not just of my time but of my skills and value. I'd felt tears spring to my eyes. "Harriet, that's incredibly kind. Can I think about it and get back to you? I'm not sure when I'll be returning." "Of course, take all the time you need. Just know that you're wanted here, Patricia. You make a real difference in people's lives." After hanging up, I'd stood in Diane's kitchen, overwhelmed by the contrast. Strangers at a senior center valued me enough to create a paid position. My own son couldn't value me enough to give me a seat at his Thanksgiving table. That night, I'd finally listened to all of Marcus's voicemails in order. The progression was telling. The first few had been confused, asking what the letter was about, suggesting there must be some mistake. Then anger, accusing me of being manipulative and melodramatic, saying I was embarrassing myself. Then bargaining, suggesting we could talk this through, that maybe he'd been a bit harsh but I was overreacting. And finally, the most recent ones, a hint of genuine distress creeping into his voice. The last voicemail, left just that morning, had been different from all the others. "Mom, it's Marcus. Please call me back. Something's happened and I need to talk to you. It's about the kids. My grandchildren." Despite everything, my heart had clenched with worry. Were they all right? Had something happened to them? But before I could spiral into panic, my phone had dinged with a text from Lauren, her first in several days. "Mom, you need to talk to Marcus. The kids are asking for you and he doesn't know what to tell them. You're being selfish." Selfish. The word that had been applied to women throughout history whenever they dared to prioritize their own needs or demand respect. I typed and deleted 3 responses before finally settling on something simple. "I'll reach out when I'm ready. The children are resilient. They'll be fine." But Lauren's response had been immediate and cutting. "Maya cried herself to sleep last night asking why Grandma doesn't love her anymore. How does that make you feel? Congratulations on your petty revenge. You're hurting 8 and 6-year-olds now." The words had been designed to wound, and they'd succeeded. Maya and Jacob, my grandchildren, innocent parties in this adult conflict. I'd watched them grow from babies, had been at the hospital when each was born, had provided childcare twice a week since Maya's birth 8 years ago. The idea that they thought I didn't love them, that they were suffering because of this situation Marcus had created, was almost unbearable. Almost. Because the more I'd thought about it, reading Lauren's text over and over, the more I'd realized what was actually happening. This was manipulation, pure and simple, using the children as weapons, as leverage to force me back into compliance. And while I ached for my grandchildren's confusion, I also recognized that their discomfort was a direct result of how their father had treated me, not my response to that treatment. I'd shown Diane the text, and my sister's face had darkened with anger. "That is low. That is unacceptably low. She's trying to guilt you into backing down by using your love for those children against you." "I know," I'd said quietly, "and it's working. Want to call Marcus to explain to the kids that I love them, that this has nothing to do with them. But if you do that, Diane had said carefully, you give up all your power. You show Marcus that he can treat you however he wants as long as he threatens to keep you from the grandchildren. Is that the dynamic you want? The question had hung between us. Was I willing to endure being separated from Maya and Jacob to make my point? Was the principle worth that particular cost? I'd gone to bed that night without answering, troubled by dreams where my grandchildren cried out for me and I couldn't reach them, held back by invisible barriers. The next morning had brought more messages, but these were from unexpected sources. First, a Facebook message from Sandra Wu, a woman I knew casually from Harold's work, the wife of one of his fellow teachers. Patricia, I heard about what happened with Marcus. I just want you to know that I think you're incredibly brave. I've been dealing with similar issues with my own daughter, and your strength in setting boundaries is inspiring. If you ever want to talk, I'm here. Then an email from my old nursing supervisor, Martha, whom I hadn't heard from in 5 years. Patricia, ran into Lauren at the grocery store, and she mentioned you were having family troubles. I don't know the details and don't need to, but I wanted to reach out. Remember that time you told me I needed to stand up to my sister who was treating me like her personal assistant? Your advice changed my life. Sometimes we're better at seeing what others need than applying it to ourselves. Whatever you're dealing with, trust your instincts. You've always had good ones. The messages had continued throughout the day. A former colleague from the hospital, a neighbor from my old house, even my hairdresser, who'd apparently heard something through the small-town gossip network. The common thread was support, validation, and often their own stories of family members who'd taken them for granted until they'd finally pushed back. I'd realized, reading through these messages, that I wasn't alone in this experience. That countless women, particularly mothers and grandmothers, faced similar dismissal of their contributions, similar expectations that they should be endlessly available and grateful for whatever scraps of inclusion they received. And many of them, unlike me, never pushed back, never demanded better, just accepted that this was how family worked. That afternoon I'd made a decision. I called Janet Pierce, my attorney, and asked her to proceed with the estate planning changes I'd mentioned in the letter to Marcus. I wanted everything formalized, legally binding, so that my children understood this wasn't an empty threat. The bulk of my modest estate would go to charities I cared about and to Diane. Marcus and Lauren would each receive a token amount, $5,000, enough to make clear they hadn't been forgotten but rather deliberately excluded. Janet had been supportive but had urged me to take more time. Patricia, you can always make these changes later if you still feel this is the right move. Once you sign these documents, there's a process to revise them, and your children will have documentation of your intentions. Are you certain this is what you want? I'm certain that I want control over my own legacy, I'd replied. For 43 years, I've put my children first. I've organized my life around their needs, their wants, their convenience. And when I needed them to simply give me a seat at a table, when I needed basic acknowledgement of my value, I was found wanting. Yes, Janet, I'm certain. The documents were drawn up within a week. Signing them had felt both liberating and terrifying. A line crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. But I'd done it, had taken concrete action to back up my words, to prove that this wasn't emotional manipulation but a fundamental shift in how I understood my role and rights. The holidays approached, Christmas looming with all its complicated family dynamics. Diane had invited me to stay through New Year's, to join her and her friends for their celebrations, and I'd accepted gratefully. The idea of spending Christmas alone in my apartment, knowing Marcus and Lauren were celebrating without me, would have been unbearable. But spending it in a different city, with people who valued my presence, felt like the fresh start I desperately needed. A week before Christmas, I'd finally responded to Marcus's voicemails, not with a call but with a carefully composed email. I drafted it over several days, running versions past Diane and Janet until it said exactly what I needed it to say without giving Marcus any ammunition to use against me. The email had been direct. I'd acknowledged receiving his messages and Lauren's texts about the children. I'd explained that my absence was a direct consequence of how he'd treated me on Thanksgiving, and that until he was willing to genuinely acknowledge the hurt he'd caused and make meaningful amends, I would be maintaining distance from him and his family. I'd made clear that my decision to revise my estate plans was final and legally documented, that this wasn't a negotiating tactic but a reflection of my values, and how I chose to leave my legacy. I told him that I loved him and always would, but that love didn't require me to accept mistreatment or to make myself available to people who'd made clear they didn't value my presence. And I'd ended by saying that when and if he was ready to have a real conversation, one where he listened and took responsibility rather than defending his actions or minimizing my feelings, I would consider meeting with him. But that conversation would happen on my timeline in a setting I chose with terms I set. Sending that email had felt like dropping a bomb. I'd hovered over the send button for a full minute before finally pressing it, then immediately closed my laptop and gone for a long walk to avoid obsessively checking for his response. When I'd returned 2 hours later, there had been a reply, but it wasn't what I'd hoped for. Marcus had written a long defensive message, explaining again why he'd been right to establish boundaries on Thanksgiving, how I'd made Stephanie uncomfortable by showing up without bringing anything, how his in-laws had questioned his parenting when I'd left upset. He'd acknowledged that maybe he could have handled it better, but suggested I shared responsibility for the conflict by being inflexible and making everything about me. The email had ended with a demand, thinly veiled as a request, that I reconsider my estate plans and return to my normal role in the family, particularly regarding the grandchildren who didn't deserve to be punished for adult conflicts. There had been no real apology, no acknowledgement of my perspective, just more justification for why he'd been right and I'd been wrong, with a token concession that maybe his delivery could have been gentler. I'd read it once, felt my blood pressure spike, and then saved it to a folder without responding. Diane had found me sitting at her kitchen table, staring at nothing, and had immediately known what had happened. He didn't give you what you needed. He doubled down, I'd said flatly. Made it clear that he thinks I'm entirely at fault, that I'm being unreasonable, and that the only acceptable resolution is me returning to exactly how things were before. So what are you going to do? I'd looked at my sister, this woman who'd built a life on her own terms, who'd never let family obligation or social pressure dictate her choices, and I'd felt something settle deep in my chest. I'm going to let him live with the consequences. I'm going to rebuild my own life, find my own value, and stop waiting for my children to give me permission to matter. Diane had smiled, proud and a little sad. Good. That's exactly what you should do. And you'll start by accepting that job at the senior center and finding an apartment here if you want one. Build something new, Patricia. Something that's yours. The idea had been growing in me for days, the possibility of not returning to my old city, of making a clean break from the life I'd known. Diane's city offered opportunities. A fresh start where I wasn't defined by my role as Marcus's mother or Harold's widow, where I could be simply Patricia, a woman with skills and interests and value that existed independent of family connections. I'd spent the week before Christmas apartment hunting, looking at places that would accept a year lease, that would give me stability while I figured out what came next. The senior center job was still waiting for me, and Harriet had been thrilled when I'd called to accept, asking if I could start in January. I'd begun to imagine what my days might look like, filled with purpose and connection but on my own terms, without the constant anxiety of waiting for Marcus to need something or to deem me worthy of inclusion. Christmas morning arrived cold and bright. Diane and I had exchanged modest gifts, spent the morning drinking coffee and watching classic movies, and then headed to her friend Carol's house for dinner. Carol hosted an annual gathering for friends who, for whatever reason, didn't have traditional family celebrations to attend. There were 8 of us around her table, ranging in age from late 30s to early 70s, all with our own stories of why we were there rather than with blood relatives. As we'd gone around the table sharing gratitudes, as Carol did every year, I'd found myself speaking truth I hadn't fully acknowledged before. I'm grateful for the opportunity to redefine family, to understand that the people who sit at your table should be there because you want them, because they add something meaningful to your life, not out of obligation or guilt. And I'm grateful for the courage to walk away from situations that diminish me, even when that means walking away from people I love. The table had been quiet for a moment, then Carol had raised her glass. To Patricia, and to all of us who've learned that we teach people how to treat us, may we continue to set boundaries that honor our worth. Later that evening, back at Diane's house, my phone had rung with a FaceTime call from Maya, my granddaughter. For the first time in over a month, I'd answered, unable to resist seeing her face even though I knew this was likely orchestrated by Marcus or Lauren. Maya's sweet face had filled my screen, her eyes lighting up when she saw me. Grandma! It's you. We've been trying to call you forever. Where are you? Why didn't you come for Christmas? We made you a present. My heart had ached. Hi, sweetheart. I've been visiting my sister, having a little vacation. I'm sorry I wasn't there for Christmas. Did you have a good day? It was okay, Maya had said, her 8-year-old face scrunching with thought. But Daddy was sad. He said you're mad at him. Are you mad at me too? The question had nearly broken me. Oh, sweetheart, no. I'm not mad at you at all. I love you so much. Sometimes grown-ups have disagreements that have nothing to do with kids, and that's what's happening with me and your daddy. But you'll come back, right? You'll still be our grandma? Jacob had appeared in the frame then, his 6-year-old face anxious. Grandma, come home. Daddy said you might not come back. Please come back. I'd heard a voice in the background, Marcus calling the kids away, and then the screen had shifted to show my son, his face drawn, the confident principal persona stripped away to show genuine distress. Mom, the kids wanted to call you. I didn't put them up to this. They're really struggling with you being gone. Then maybe you should explain to them why I'm gone, I'd said, keeping my voice level despite the emotion churning through me. Maybe you should tell them about how you treated me on Thanksgiving, and let them draw their own conclusions about who's responsible for this situation. Marcus had flinched. I'm not going to burden them with adult problems. But Mom, come on. It's Christmas. Can't we put this aside for today at least? The kids need stability, need to know their grandmother loves them. I do love them, Marcus, but loving them doesn't mean accepting your treatment of me. And using them as emotional leverage isn't going to change my mind. It's just going to make me more certain that I've made the right choice in setting boundaries. Boundaries, Marcus had repeated, his voice taking on an edge. Is that what we're calling this? Running away to another state, changing your will, refusing to even talk to your own family? Those aren't boundaries, Mom, that's punishment. You're punishing all of us because your feelings got hurt. There it was again, that dismissal, that minimization of what had happened. Your feelings got hurt, as if being denied dinner by my own son was equivalent to a minor social slight. My feelings didn't get hurt, Marcus. My fundamental worth as a person was dismissed. There's a difference. And until you can understand that difference, we don't have much to talk about. I'd ended the call before he could respond, my hands shaking, tears streaming down my face. Diane had appeared immediately, wrapping me in a hug while I sobbed out the pain of seeing my grandchildren's faces, of knowing they were confused and hurting, of recognizing that Marcus still, even now, couldn't see what he'd done wrong. You did the right thing, Diane had murmured. It hurts like hell, but you did the right thing. You didn't back down, didn't let him manipulate you with the kids, didn't accept his framing of this situation. I'm proud of you, Patricia. That night, alone in Diane's guest room, I'd written in the journal I'd started keeping since arriving. Page after page of thoughts and feelings, processing the grief of this family rupture alongside the growing sense of my own strength and autonomy. I'd written about Harold, wondering what he would think of all this, whether he'd support me or urge me to reconcile. I'd written about my grandchildren, about the pain of being separated from them, but also about refusing to teach them through my example that women should accept mistreatment from family. And I'd written about the future, about the person I was becoming, someone who could stand alone, who could weather loss and rejection without crumbling, who could choose self-respect over the false peace of pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. The week between Christmas and New Year's brought a flurry of activity. I'd signed a lease on a cozy one-bedroom apartment 10 minutes from Diane's house, with hardwood floors and a small balcony that overlooked a park. I'd arranged for my belongings to be moved from my old apartment, hiring movers since I couldn't ask Marcus or Lauren for help without undermining my stance. I'd met with Harriet at the senior center to finalize my employment, discussing curriculum ideas and programming expansion. Each action had felt like laying foundation stones for a new life, one where I defined my own worth and chose my own path. It was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure, this late-life reinvention, but it also felt necessary, inevitable, the only way forward that didn't require me to diminish myself. New Year's Eve arrived with an invitation from Carol to her annual party. I'd gone with Diane wearing a dress I'd bought specifically for the occasion, the first new clothing I'd purchased for myself in months. The party had been warm and welcoming, full of interesting people with fascinating stories. I'd found myself in a long conversation with a retired professor named Martin, discussing history and philosophy and the nature of family obligation across cultures. When midnight approached, everyone had gathered for the countdown, and as the clock struck 12, as everyone cheered and hugged and toasted the new year, I'd felt something release in my chest. The old year, with all its pain and loss and revelation, was behind me. The new year stretched ahead, full of possibility, and for the first time since Harold's death, I felt genuinely excited about what might come next. Diane had found me on Carol's back deck later, looking up at the stars, and had raised her glass to mine. To new beginnings, little sister. To knowing your worth and demanding that others recognize it too. To new beginnings, I'd echoed. And silently to myself, I'd added another toast. To revenge served not hot or cold, but simply by living well, by refusing to accept less than I deserved, by showing my children through action rather than words what it looked like to honor yourself even when it cost you everything you'd thought you couldn't live without. The first week of January brought both my move into the new apartment and my first official day at the senior center. Both transitions went smoothly, almost suspiciously so, as if the universe was confirming that I'd made the right choices. My apartment filled with my familiar belongings, transformed from the storage boxes of my last move into a real home. The senior center welcomed me with a small celebration, complete with a cake that read, "Welcome Patricia," in blue frosting, and my students cheered when I walked into the computer lab for the first time in 2 months. But the week also brought a letter, not from Marcus or Lauren, but from Stephanie, my daughter-in-law. It arrived at Diane's address, forwarded from my old apartment, and something about seeing her handwriting on the envelope made my stomach clench. I'd set it aside all day, not ready to deal with whatever it contained, but that evening, fortified by a glass of wine in Diane's presence, I'd finally opened it. The letter had been typed, formal, 3 pages long. Stephanie had written as a lawyer, I'd realized immediately, not as a daughter-in-law, her language careful and strategic. She'd outlined her perspective on the Thanksgiving incident, explaining that she'd spent considerable time and money on the meal, that her parents had contributed substantially, and that it was reasonable to expect guests to reciprocate in some way. She'd acknowledged that Marcus perhaps hadn't communicated this expectation clearly, but insisted that my reaction had been disproportionate and damaging to family harmony. The second page had detailed the impact of my absence on Maya and Jacob, their behavioral changes, their anxiety about my love for them, the questions they asked that were difficult to answer. Stephanie had made clear that she viewed my withdrawal as emotionally manipulative, using the children as pawns in an adult conflict, and that as a mother herself, she found my behavior troubling and selfish. The third page had been the most calculated. Stephanie had outlined what she called a path forward, a series of conditions under which I could resume my relationship with Marcus's family. I would need to acknowledge that my response to Thanksgiving was excessive. I would need to apologize to Marcus for the distress my letter had caused. I would need to reverse my estate planning changes, as they created an unhealthy dynamic and sent the wrong message to Maya and Jacob about family loyalty. And I would need to commit to being more considerate of household boundaries and expectations going forward, recognizing that Marcus and Stephanie's home operated under their rules. In exchange for meeting these conditions, Stephanie wrote, I would be welcomed back into the family fold, allowed to resume babysitting and attending family events, included in holidays going forward assuming I contributed appropriately. The letter had ended with a deadline, February 1st, 3 weeks away, by which time I needed to respond or they would interpret my silence as a decision to permanently separate from Marcus's family. I'd read the letter twice, feeling my blood pressure rise with each paragraph. This wasn't an olive branch. It was an ultimatum. This wasn't reconciliation. It was capitulation. Stephanie had laid out terms that required me to accept full responsibility for the conflict, to grovel for the privilege of being included in my own son's life, to promise to be a good little mother who knew her place and didn't cause problems. Diane had read the letter over my shoulder, her expression darkening. This is unbelievable. She's actually trying to dictate the terms of your relationship with your own son and grandchildren. And that deadline, that's a power play, pure and simple. I know, I'd said quietly. She wants me to feel pressured, desperate, willing to agree to anything to get my family back. But you're not, are you? Diane had searched my face. You're not actually considering accepting these terms? I'd looked at my sister, this woman who'd never let anyone else define her worth or her choices, and I'd felt absolutely clear about my answer. Not a chance. If these are the terms Marcus and Stephanie think are acceptable, if they genuinely believe I should apologize for being hurt by their treatment, then they've confirmed everything I suspected. They don't see me as a person deserving respect. They see me as a resource to be managed, a convenience to be utilized when needed and dismissed when inconvenient. So what will you do? I'd folded the letter carefully, tucking it back into its envelope. I'm going to do exactly what I've been doing. I'm going to build my life here, invest in my work at the senior center, develop friendships with people who value me, and I'm going to let Marcus and Stephanie live with their choices, just as I'm living with mine. And the deadline? Let it pass. Their arbitrary timeline doesn't obligate me to respond or comply. If they choose to interpret my silence as permanent separation, that's their choice. But I'm not going to negotiate with someone who thinks they have the right to set conditions on my dignity. The days that followed had been busy, deliberately so. I'd thrown myself into work at the senior center, developing new programs, connecting with students, finding genuine satisfaction in being useful and appreciated. I'd attended a book club meeting with several of Diane's friends and discovered I loved the intellectual stimulation of discussing literature with other readers. I'd started taking a watercolor painting class at the community center, tapping into a creative side I'd neglected for decades while prioritizing everyone else's needs. My life was becoming full in ways it hadn't been even before Harold's death. During my marriage, I'd organized my time around his schedule, my children's needs, the expectations of being a wife and mother. After his death, I drifted, uncertain of my purpose without those familiar roles to anchor me. But now, for the first time in my adult life, I was choosing how to spend my time based solely on what interested me, what fulfilled me, what brought me joy. There were hard moments, certainly. Times when I'd see a grandmother with her grandchildren at the park and feel the ache of missing Maya and Jacob. Times when I'd remember holidays past, the laughter and chaos of family gatherings, and grieve for what I'd lost. Times when I'd wonder if I was being stubborn, if pride was keeping me from reaching out, from being the bigger person and making peace even if it meant swallowing some of my hurt. But then I'd remember Marcus's face when he told me I couldn't eat because I hadn't contributed. I'd remember Lauren's message accusing me of being selfish for setting boundaries. I'd remember Stephanie's letter, with its cold conditions and power plays. And I'd know that going back, accepting their terms, would require me to betray myself in ways I couldn't recover from. February 1st came and went without any communication from me to Marcus or Stephanie. The deadline passed and I felt nothing but relief that I hadn't caved to the pressure, hadn't let their artificial timeline force me into premature reconciliation on their terms. I'd wondered if there would be follow-up, more pressure, escalating demands. Instead, there was silence. The silence stretched for 2 weeks, and I began to understand that Marcus and Stephanie had accepted my non-response as the answer Stephanie had outlined. They'd closed the door on me, or perhaps more accurately, I'd closed it on them. Either way, the separation that had started as a boundary was calcifying into something more permanent. Then, mid-February, something unexpected happened. I'd received a call from Maya's school, the elementary school where she attended 3rd grade. The school counselor, a woman named Mrs. Rodriguez, had asked if I could come in for a conversation about my granddaughter. My first instinct had been panic, worry that something was wrong with Maya. But Mrs. Rodriguez had assured me it wasn't an emergency, just a conversation that needed to happen. I'd driven the 3 hours back to my old city, feeling strange returning to familiar streets after nearly 3 months away. The school had been easy to find, and Mrs. Rodriguez had been warm and welcoming when I'd arrived at her office. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Greenwood. I know you've moved away, but Maya has been struggling lately, and in our conversations your name comes up frequently. Is she all right? Her father didn't mention any problems." I'd felt defensive, aware that I was walking into a situation where Marcus and Stephanie might have framed me as the problem. "Maya is having some anxiety issues," Mrs. Rodriguez had explained carefully. "She's been withdrawn in class, has had several incidents of crying, and her grades have started to slip. When I've talked to her about what's troubling her, she talks about you, about feeling confused because you left and not understanding why adults can't just fix their problems and be a family again. The words had pierced me. I see. And what do her parents say about the situation? Mrs. Rodriguez had hesitated, choosing her words carefully. Mr. and Mrs. Mitchell have explained that there was a family conflict and you've chosen to distance yourself. They've indicated that you're welcome to return but haven't chosen to do so. However, Maya's interpretation of events is somewhat different. She believes her father did something to make you leave, though she's not clear on what exactly, and she feels responsible for fixing it but doesn't know how. She's not responsible, I'd said firmly. This is entirely an adult conflict. Maya and her brother are innocent parties who shouldn't be burdened with any of this. I agree completely, Mrs. Rodriguez had said, which is why I'm reaching out to you. Maya needs reassurance that you love her, that your absence isn't about her. And ideally, she needs the adults in her life to resolve their conflict in a way that doesn't require her to choose sides or carry adult burdens. We'd talked for over an hour, Mrs. Rodriguez asking careful questions about the situation, never taking sides but clearly trying to understand the full picture. I'd explained the Thanksgiving incident, the letter I'd sent, the responses from Marcus and Stephanie. I'd shown her the letter from Stephanie with its conditions and deadline, wanting Mrs. Rodriguez to understand that I hadn't simply abandoned my grandchildren on a whim. When I'd finished, Mrs. Rodriguez had been quiet for a long moment. Mrs. Greenwood, I'm not a family therapist, but I work with children dealing with adult conflicts daily. What I can tell you is that Maya is caught in the middle of something she can't understand or fix, and it's affecting her well-being. Whatever happened between you and her father, whatever justified anger or hurt you're feeling, Maya is paying a price. I know that, I'd said, tears threatening. I hate that she's hurting. But what am I supposed to do? Accept mistreatment just to avoid causing her stress? Teach her through my example that women should tolerate disrespect from family? Those aren't your only two options, Mrs. Rodriguez had suggested gently. You can maintain your boundaries with Marcus, while still finding ways to be present for Maya. You can communicate directly with her in appropriate ways about your love for her while being honest that you and her father have disagreements. You don't have to choose between your dignity and your relationship with your granddaughter. The words had settled over me like a revelation. I'd been thinking in binary terms, all or nothing, either accepting Marcus's treatment or walking away completely. But Mrs. Rodriguez was suggesting a third path, one where I could maintain my self-respect while still showing up for Maya and Jacob in whatever ways were possible. We discussed options. I could write letters to Maya, explaining my love for her while being clear that sometimes grown-ups have conflicts that take time to resolve. I could send packages, little reminders that I was thinking of her. I could, if Marcus agreed, arrange supervised visits with just the grandchildren, removing him and Stephanie from the equation temporarily. The conversation with Mrs. Rodriguez changed everything. I left the school with a new understanding that protecting myself didn't require abandoning my grandchildren entirely. That evening I drafted a letter to Maya, carefully worded to reassure her of my love while avoiding details that would burden her with adult problems. I told her about my new apartment, the painting class I was taking, the seniors I was teaching at the community center. I'd explained that sometimes grown-ups need space to work through disagreements, but that space never meant I stopped loving her or thinking about her. I'd mailed it the next day, along with a small care package containing art supplies and a book I thought she'd enjoy. Then I'd done the same for Jacob, adjusting the language for his 6-year-old understanding. The act of reaching out to them directly without going through Marcus had felt revolutionary. I'd spent so long thinking of them as extensions of their father, forgetting they were separate people deserving their own relationship with me. 2 weeks later, a response arrived. Maya had sent a drawing, stick figures labeled Grandma, Maya, and Jacob holding hands under a rainbow. Below it, she'd written in her careful third-grade handwriting, "I love you, Grandma. Please don't forget about us. Love, Maya." The drawing now hung on my refrigerator, a daily reminder of what truly mattered. March brought unexpected developments. Lauren called, the first time we'd spoken since before Christmas. Her tone was different, less accusatory, almost hesitant. "Mom, can we talk? Just you and me, no Marcus, no taking sides. I need to understand what happened." We'd met at a coffee shop halfway between our cities, neutral territory where neither of us had the advantage. Lauren had looked tired, older than her 39 years, stress evident in the lines around her eyes. We'd ordered our drinks and sat in uncomfortable silence before she finally spoke. Marcus told me his version of Thanksgiving. Then Stephanie told me hers. And lately Maya's been saying things that don't match either story. I'm trying to understand what actually happened, Mom. From your perspective. I told her everything, watching her face as I recounted Marcus's words, his reasoning, the dismissal I'd felt. Lauren had listened without interrupting, her coffee growing cold in her hands. When I'd finished, she'd been quiet for a long time. I didn't know, she'd finally said. I mean, I knew something happened, but the way Marcus explained it, you'd overreacted to a misunderstanding about potluck expectations. He made it sound like you stormed out over nothing. I left because my son told me I couldn't eat at his table because I hadn't contributed enough, I'd said simply. There's no misunderstanding in that, Lauren. No ambiguity. My daughter had wiped her eyes, not quite crying but close. When Dad died, I withdrew from you. I know I did. It was easier to avoid the grief by avoiding you, because you reminded me so much of what we'd lost. And then I just stayed distant because it became habit. I'm sorry for that, Mom. I'm sorry I wasn't there when you needed me. The apology had been unexpected, overwhelming. Thank you for saying that. I'm also sorry I didn't stand up for you at Thanksgiving. I saw you leave, and I should have followed you, should have demanded to know what happened. Instead, I just accepted Marcus's explanation that you were having one of your moods. That was wrong of me. We talked for 3 hours, Lauren asking questions, me answering honestly, both of us crying at times. By the end, something had shifted between us. Not a complete repair but the beginning of rebuilding. Lauren had promised to talk to Marcus, to share her new understanding of events, to advocate for a real family conversation where everyone could be heard. I can't promise he'll listen, she'd warned. Marcus can be stubborn, and Stephanie influences him more than he probably realizes. But I'll try, Mom. You deserve better than how you've been treated. April brought that family conversation, though it didn't happen the way I'd hoped. Marcus had finally agreed to meet, but only with conditions. Stephanie would be present. We'd meet at a therapist's office with a mediator. Each person would have uninterrupted time to share their perspective. The goal was understanding, not resolution, with no pressure for immediate reconciliation. I'd agreed, hoping professional mediation might create space for genuine communication. The therapist, Dr. Helen Kim, had been skilled at managing the session, establishing ground rules, creating safety for vulnerability. Marcus had gone first, explaining his perspective on Thanksgiving, his belief that he'd been trying to establish healthy boundaries, his hurt at my dramatic response and ongoing distance. Stephanie had followed, reiterating the points from her letter, emphasizing the impact on Maya and Jacob, framing my actions as emotionally manipulative. Lauren had spoken next, surprising everyone by sharing her own awakening to how our family had taken me for granted, how we'd failed to see the full picture of my contributions and sacrifices. When my turn came, I'd shared everything. Not just the Thanksgiving incident but the years leading up to it, the small dismissals, the ways I'd felt my value diminishing after Harold's death, the loneliness of widowhood combined with the realization that my children saw me primarily as a resource rather than a person. I talked about the letters I'd written to Maya and Jacob, my commitment to maintaining those relationships regardless of what happened with Marcus. The session had been emotionally exhausting, and Dr. Kim had suggested we schedule follow-up appointments before attempting any decisions about reconciliation. Marcus had agreed, though his body language remained defensive. Stephanie had been harder to read, her lawyer mask firmly in place. Over the next 2 months we'd met bi-weekly, slowly unpacking decades of family dynamics, unexpressed resentments, unmet expectations. Marcus had eventually acknowledged that his Thanksgiving decision had been hurtful, though he'd struggled to understand why it had been so devastating. The breakthrough came when Dr. Kim had asked him to imagine his own children treating him the same way in 40 years. How would you feel, she'd asked, if Maya told you that you couldn't eat at her Thanksgiving table because you hadn't contributed enough? If she dismissed all the years of love and support you'd given her, reducing your worth to whether you'd brought a side dish? I'd watched understanding finally dawn on Marcus's face, The first genuine recognition that he'd wounded me deeply. I didn't think of it that way, he'd admitted quietly. I was focused on the immediate situation, on what seemed fair in that moment. I didn't consider the larger message I was sending about Mom's value to me. Progress had been slow but real. Marcus had apologized, not the defensive partial apology of his earlier attempts but a genuine acknowledgement of harm caused. Stephanie had been slower to come around, but even she'd eventually admitted that her letter had been unnecessarily harsh, that she'd let her protective instincts for Marcus override her compassion for me. By summer we'd reached a new understanding. I wouldn't be returning to my old city or my old role in Marcus's life. The twice-weekly babysitting was gone, replaced by monthly Sunday dinners where I was a guest, not an employee. The financial support and emergency assistance I provided was permanently withdrawn, with Marcus and Stephanie learning to manage their lives without my constant backup. My estate plans remained unchanged, a concrete reminder that my legacy was mine to determine. But I had my grandchildren back in a healthier way than before. Maya and I exchanged letters weekly, and I visited once a month, staying in a hotel rather than at Marcus's house, maintaining boundaries that protected my autonomy. Jacob was learning that Grandma was a person with her own life, not just someone who existed to serve his family's needs. Lauren and I had rebuilt our relationship, meeting regularly, talking honestly, finally seeing each other as full people rather than just mother and daughter trapped in old patterns. She'd even visited my new apartment, met Diane, joined me for dinner with my book club friends. Now, as November approached again, nearly a year after the Thanksgiving that had changed everything, I stood in my apartment arranging flowers for my own small celebration. Diane was coming, along with Carol and Martin and several other friends I'd made during my year of reinvention. Lauren would be there too by her choice, having declined Marcus's invitation to spend the holiday with him. Marcus had invited me to join his family for Thanksgiving, a genuine invitation this time, with assurances that I was wanted and valued. I thanked him and declined, not out of spite or ongoing anger, but because I'd built something new, something that centered my own needs and preferences rather than organizing my life around his. The doorbell rang, and I opened it to find Diane with a pie and a wide smile. "Ready for your first Thanksgiving as a fully liberated woman?" she asked. I'd looked around my apartment, at the table set for 8, at the evidence of the life I'd built from the ashes of rejection, at the person I'd become through choosing myself. "More than ready," I'd replied. "This year, everyone at my table knows exactly how much they're valued, because they're here by mutual choice, not obligation. That's the real feast." As my guests arrived, filling my home with laughter and warmth, I'd realized that Marcus's denial of food on that Thanksgiving a year ago had been a terrible gift. It had forced me to see clearly what I'd been unwilling to acknowledge, to demand better treatment, to discover my own strength. My revenge hadn't been dramatic or destructive. It had been simply refusing to accept less than I deserved, building a life that reflected my worth, and teaching my family through my absence what they'd lost by taking me for granted. And that, I'd learned, was the most powerful revenge of all. Not destruction but transformation. Not punishment but growth. Not bitterness but the sweet victory of self-respect reclaimed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.